Time for yet another somber video on game design. Today we're going to be talking about a topic that a lot of developers tend to fail on and why it comes back to bite them in a very big way. It was announced yesterday that game developer studio Icepick Lodge is suffering from some major financial issues following the commercial failure of Pathologic 2. Now, if you don't know the studio, they are the makers of some of the most artistically rich games that I am pretty sure most of you watching this have never played, let alone heard of before. I'm also sure I'm one of the few people who actually played and reviewed Pathologic 2 to begin with. And the studio itself has had a very long history of making very divisive games in terms of their design and storytelling. These are titles that you will not see from any other studio, for better and worse in this case. But it represents yet another major point when it comes to game development. And that's the importance of getting people invested in your game, or as we've used the term before, onboarding. And while this may sound like a very boring and unimportant topic, it's one that's becoming more and more vital for developers, especially those of the indie variety who are working on very unique titles to begin with. But when we talk about the concept of onboarding for a game, we're referring to essentially how do you wean a player onto a title. And this involves a lot of different aspects of game development. UI design, the actual control scheme itself, tutorials, even simple things such as having a menu and options. All impact how somebody approaches a game for the first time. Now with Pathologic 2 over there, while this may be considered Icepick Lodge's most accessible game to date, that's still not really saying much. The first 30 to 40 minutes of the game is essentially you going through a series of crazy vignettes that may or may not have any bearing on the plot or your choices going forward, and is also the quasi-tutorial. Except the tutorial doesn't really teach you anything about the survival mechanics and general gameplay loop that occurs once you start playing the game for real, which the game kind of plays out like almost like a survival take on Majora's Mask. And those weird looking guys up there may or may not have a part in that. And this has always been Icepick Lodge's MO when it comes to their games. They're, from a storytelling perspective, one of the most unique series you will ever find. But their onboarding or their new player experience has always been terrible. And before we leave it at that, again, keep in mind that we can say the same for a lot of games from independent developers, whether they're a first-timer or long established. And there's several reasons for this. When it comes to Pathologic over there, the problem the game has is that the developers have gone with the MO of the game needs to be mysterious. And again, we've talked about this in a previous topic, that the learning of the game is part of the gameplay loop itself. And what that means is that you're playing the game to begin with on the account that you're going to fail. And that it's going to take multiple playthroughs and so on and so forth before you finally get it, and then you can play the game proper. Now, some developers have trouble when it comes to onboarding simply because they don't do a good enough job in terms of their UI and tutorial design. But wherever the case may be, the new player's experience, or the first thing somebody will see when they play a game, is very important when it comes to keeping them invested, and most importantly, making sure people are going to cover your game to begin with. Because as we've seen over this decade, with so many games being released on a day-to-day basis, we don't have the time to find the fun. And that is a statement that has a lot of weight associated to it. Because there are plenty of challenging games out there. XCOM, Darkest Dungeon, La Mulana, Factorio, Kerbal Space Program, and we can certainly keep going for the next few minutes naming them. But As we've said many times over, I know a few of you are getting ready for me to say my favorite quote, losing is not fun. And by extension, difficulty does not or is not a measure of greatness in a game. You can have a title that is challenging to play, but if the actual learning of the game is frustrating or difficult, people aren't going to stick around. And this is a very big point about a lot of the titles from Paradox Interactive, as we've talked about many times before. That Paradox has made some of the most mechanically deep 4X games around. They have essentially cornered the market in that regard, but it is a very niche market because they do a terrible job in terms of onboarding. And again, when we talk about this, for a lot of people who are already fans of their respective games and genres, they don't care about this at all. I am sure with Pathologic 2 up there, just as with Ice Pick Lodge's other games, they have a very vocal minority of hardcore fans who play their games all the way through, who have seen everything there is in Pathologic 1. And they tell them, the game's fine, it's everybody else's wrong, or, there's no problem, this game is easy to understand. But the problem when it comes to this is that if you're trying to grow the reach of your game, you have to understand that people are going to look at your title who have not followed you at all. And at the end of the day, the consumer will only see two things about a video game. Whatever's on your store page, and whatever their favorite YouTuber or streamer or site is going to cover that game with. And in many cases, you may not even be able to get them to look at your store page. And this has been a major point for a lot of these indie games that have came out over this past decade. I have played so many titles that, again, within the first 15 to 30 minutes, I can usually tell whether or not this game is going to be good or bad, and more importantly, whether or not it's going to sell well. And I know that sounds very weird, but it's very easy for someone like me to approach a game and just see, am I able to really enjoy this game from minute one? Another very favorite phrase of mine is this whole idea of the real game begins at X. And that goes back to Pathologic 2. That the game literally does not start until after about, I think it was like 30 to 40 minutes of pre-tutorial crazy shenanigans. And again, with today's market of having a 2-hour refund window, people don't want to have to spend 40 minutes to an hour before the game actually begins so they can start to see whether or not it works. And nor should they have to. And this is one of those points that can be very salient for independent developers, especially those who focus more on the art rather than the business. Another really good example of this would be the studio Tale of Tales, who have also made very artistically driven games that I'm sure most of you watching this right now have never played. But we're going to do our quick Patreon supporter and sponsor shout out now, and when we return, we're going to go back to Pathologic 2 over there, and I want to talk a little bit more about what are some things to pay attention to when it comes to the onboarding process. And now for a quick thank you to our current Game Wisdom sponsors and Patreon supporters. And if you'd like to continue the discussion on game design, be sure to check out our Discord channel, linked down below. So far in this video, we've talked about how important the new player's experience and onboarding is to getting them invested in a game. But we haven't really examined or talked about the big point. How do you do that? And it is a very tough thing to approach because, again, every game's design or every gameplay loop is different in approach and what you can properly explain to someone. And this has been a very big point when it comes to talking about games that are technically on the more advanced side, but can still explain things at a very rudimentary level. Now, for instance, something like Factorio. The onboarding is built into the progression curve itself. When you start playing the game, you don't have access to everything because, guess what? You haven't unlocked it yet. And as you play through and start to figure out the tools in your toolbox, more things become unlocked as a reward, but only when you've kind of proven to yourself that you can do it. With a game like Pathologic 2 here, the minute the game begins officially, it starts to throw all manner of crazy things at you, from curfews to the very fact that when you begin the game, as a bit of a story spoiler, everyone assumes that you are a murderer. So for the first about after the 40-minute tutorial, there's a good 20 to 30 minutes of playing the game where every civilian will try and kill you. And that's in part of the game's onboarding process. And like we said in the last part, difficulty does not mean greatness. And the best games, even those that are on the complicated or hard to play side, can still do a lot to make sure the player has a good first time experience. Both Darkest Dungeon and XCOM 2 are very challenging games. They are very punishing when it comes to failure. But they both do whatever they can to make the first 30 minutes to an hour of play as easy to understand as possible. And yes, I know some of you are probably going to say, it does slow down the game to begin with. XCOM features a lot of exposition in terms of cutscenes and dialogue. That does make things a little bit slow at the beginning. With Darkest Dungeon, you do have to repeat the tutorial and the first level every time you start a new game. But it's very important to have these procedures and elements in place. Because another point is that if your onboarding is not good, then what happens if somebody who stops playing your game decides to come back, let's say, a few weeks or a month later? Are they going to be able to pick up right where they left off, or are they going to be completely lost? One thing that I really hate about a lot of free-to-play and kind of mobile-based designs is the fact that you can't start over. So if, let's say, I leave a game and then come back 5 months, 6 months, whatever down the line, I can't repeat the tutorial or review anything. I'm back to where I was right then and there, and I'm expected to have all that time spent, right back in my memory. Even something with like profile and prestige systems run into this issue, such as Payday 2. And it's again one of those problems that for a lot of developers out there, they don't necessarily think about games like this, especially when you're building something that is either unique or something that you're aiming towards a niche market. And this is a common criticism of onboarding and the new player experience. That if I am aiming towards, the super hardcore 4X military sim fan, then why do I care about somebody who's never played the game before? And this is one of those things that for a lot of people, they'll just leave it at that. But the problem is that you will always have people who are wanting to learn a game, wanting to, dip their toe into a new experience, especially if somebody they know or a site they like tells them to check it out. But if within the first 20 minutes of playing the game, they have no idea what's going on, they're not going to want to learn it, and you can easily lose potential fans for life because of that. And like I said, games like Factorio, Darkest Dungeon, and XCOM, they are hard games to play and to master, but they still do everything they can, and they probably even do more through patches and iteration, to make sure that somebody brand new can at least get in and enjoy it. Probably the only exception to this rule would be something like Kerbal Space Program, which is hard to learn and even harder to master. But that is more an exception to the rule, because of the very fact that it basically says on the box or on the store page, this is a game about rocket science. There's only so far you can go to make a rocket science easy to learn there. But with a game like Pathologic 2 and the footage that you've seen, here's the bit of a point here. What I've shown you in the last part and here is all from the first hour of playing this game. How many of you watching this right now know what's going on, or what my goal is, or what should I be doing? And as a further point, the developers released a patch about a few weeks after the game was released to make the game easier, and they kind of put like notes in saying that you're kind of breaking our experience or what we think you should be playing the game as. And again, like, this kind of stuff that we're talking about when it comes to onboarding and the new player experience, some of you, what I'm describing this as is basic stuff. We're talking, rudimentary game design. Others are probably wondering, why have I never heard of this before? And again, this is a very important point. And to begin to wrap things up, I want to say why. With how much the game industry has grown, both in the indie and AAA space this decade, as we've said, people don't have the time anymore to figure out your game, or again, to find the fun. And again, we're using the word fun in air quotes here, because again, Darkest Dungeon and XCOM may not exactly be everybody's cup of tea. But the point is that somebody should not have to struggle to figure out how your game works. And whether that means you need a better tutorial or a better opening, again, is on a case-by-case basis. But this is why playtesting is such an important aspect of game development. That you need people who have never played your game, just as you need people who are experts and well familiar with your market to take a look at. Because if you can make your game fundamentally easier to learn without cutting out the depth that people are expecting out of it, then you better do that every time. Because you never know who's going to be playing your game and who could become a potential fan of that genre and of you as a company. Just like with YouTube here, I make sure every video I put out is great, or at least up to my code or my standards, because I don't know what people are going to find. If I release some half-ass video on a game, that could be somebody's first exposure to me, and then they'll never watch another video again, even if that was just an off day. And the same goes for a lot of these games. You don't know if somebody who's going to be playing your game may know somebody who is a big name YouTuber or streamer, or covers video games for a living, or has friends who has friends, and so on and so forth. And if you're not able to approach your game by making it accessible to everyone, then you are basically starting your game's commercial check with one foot in the grave. And for any developers watching this, I want to ask you, what are some things you've done to make the onboarding process of your game easier? Whether it's from a UI standpoint, gameplay, or both. Well, this is a topic that, again, we'll be coming back to time and time again, and there's a lot more to discuss, but we're going to end things here. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Be sure to check out our Discord channel and Patreon link down below, and come back for daily discussions on game design here, and on game wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Until next time, have a great night. If you're looking for a book on design, my first title, 20 Essential Games to Study, is out now. It is available where most books are sold, and it comes in paper, hardcover, or digital copies. This is the perfect book for anyone interested in learning about game design, whether you are a student, enthusiast, or just a fan. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel link down below, where we hang out and chat game design, and come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it, and tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.